All right, welcome back to the History of the United States to 1877. We'll be taking a look at Unit 2 in our course, which is From Colonies to Nation, and we're almost there. We've almost created a unified nation. We tried under the Articles of Confederation, as we discussed yesterday, but there are just too many obstacles in the way, mainly being the inability of Congress to raise funds and even defend its own existence from rebellion. Starting in 1785, we're going to see numerous calls for reform. Those calls will be, for the most part, ignored. No one really has a problem with the Articles, at least not enough of a problem to show up to these conventions, until Shays' Rebellion in 1786 and 1787. In May of 1787, we're going to see a group of men get together to write, ostensibly they're saying that they're going to reform the Articles, but what they're going to do is rewrite the Constitution of the United States into our current Constitution. So that's what we're going to take a look at. So who were the people writing this Constitution? Who were they? Well, there were 55 delegates out of the more than 70 men appointed to write this Constitution. Two of these men, Roger Sherman and Robert Morris, would be signatories to the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution of 1787. 16 of these men relied on slave labor for their economic survival. Most were wealthy and possessed land. More than half were lawyers. And notably, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were absent. They were nowhere near the framing of our Constitution. Adams was serving as ambassador to England, and Jefferson was ambassador to France. Another thing to note is that a lot of the supporters of a weaker federal government, men like Patrick Henry, George Clinton, these are people that were worried about a powerful centralized force. They're going to be absent. They're not going to attend this meeting, which means their voice is not there. The only people who are in this meeting are people who want a stronger government, and that's what they're going to get. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing I'd like to point out about this convention is that it was presided over by George Washington, a man of universal reputation, and there was a strict sense of secrecy to this. William Pierce, a delegate from Georgia, would write about this in his journal, and he discussed how Washington was so determined to maintain secrecy in the convention that upon finding a page of notes on the convention floor, Washington loudly admonished the delegates for their lack of responsibility, and he thrust the page onto a table at the head of the room and said, quote, "I know not whose paper it is, but there it is. Let him who owns it take it." And he closes it. Pierce was mortified when he started looking for his own notes, and he couldn't find them. But there's no way in heck he was going to go up and get that piece of paper off that table after this public tongue lashing that Washington gave the delegation. Happily for Pierce, he went back to his room and discovered his missing notes in a jacket in his room. So this is going to be a several-month process. They maintain strict secrecy. The debates were recorded by several sources. We're going to be focusing on the journal kept by Madison, so a lot of the quotes that I will pull will be from Madison's account, and so that's where we're going to get started with this story about our Constitution. Now, there are three big debates that we're going to go through here that we need to make sure that we talk about. Representation is the biggest bugaboo that you have in this convention. That is going to split the convention right down the middle. They're not going to know what to do with representation. We're also going to talk about how they organized executive and judicial power, and finally, the elephant in the room, slavery. So we'll see what these delegates had to say about slavery. Okay, so the first major debate that we're going to discuss here is representation in Congress. And this is a really big debate because it has to do with who will wield power. We're already seeing this movement of popular sovereignty. We want the people to have a voice in their government. We want the government to be responsible to them. And that's one of the problems with this Confederation Congress that we've had in the 1780s, is that we've got this, majority of people living in, Massachusetts and Virginia, Pennsylvania. These are the larger states. and they're being countermanded by like a tiny little minority of people in Rhode Island. Rhode Island can stop progress and throw the government into financial crisis. So men like James Madison, for example, they're going to want proportional representation, which is the larger your state's population, the more representation you get in Congress. And of course, representation is not just based on population, but also on tax revenues, right? How much money you have, because that's property, right? You have to be propertied in order to vote. You have to be propertied in order to determine it. And the reason for this, just as an aside, the people who vote to increase taxes, it's only fair that they be the people who pay the taxes. If you let people who don't pay taxes determine the tax rates, there's no limiting principle, right? There's no reason for people to be to limit what you tax if the people who vote on the tax don't pay it. So that's the idea behind property being a basis for voting and being a basis for representation. So the idea here is proportional representation. Larger states would get a larger voice in the government, which is only fair because they have the most people. That's the idea of these larger states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. Sorry, brain went on. Another group of people actually be very worried about this, right? Smaller states like Delaware, Rhode Island, they're going to be worried that these larger states will be able to just dominate them. And if they wanted to be ruled by Massachusetts, a larger, more populous state, they wouldn't have broken off from Massachusetts, right? I mean, if Delaware wanted to be a part of Maryland, they wouldn't have moved away. So you've got these states, they want to maintain their sovereignty and their independence, and this would require them to be able to resist the population power, the power that these larger states could wield. And so they're demanding that each state, just like in the Confederation Congress, get one vote. Each state, one vote. We are coming together as 13 equal states. It's not your state is more populous, therefore it has more power than my state. I'm coming into this as an equal. So just like if we were to get together and try to make a decision about what to eat, and someone outweighs you, right? Well, I eat more food than you, so therefore I get 2 votes to where we eat. I'm like, no, we're going together, right? We're going to eat at the same restaurant. I should get the same vote as you, regardless of how much you eat or your size, right? So that's a bad example, but that's kind of what we're talking about here. Now, there will be a suggestion of a compromise by a man from New Jersey named David Beerley. He would note that it is unfair. He says, why should Georgia get the same number of votes as Massachusetts? They have a fraction of the population. It is unfair. However, he stated, smaller states would be destroyed and ignored with proportional representation. So he basically agrees with both sides of the argument. He's like, yep, you're right. You're right. I agree with both of you. So what's our solution to this? His solution is to erase all the existing boundaries in the country. Just erase all the existing states, erase all of the boundaries, and redraw them so that they're 13 equal divisions, right? We're just going to redraw the whole map. Let's just start over fresh. We can do that. Just erase all the historical boundaries, and we'll figure out what the population is, and then we'll break it up into 13 equal divisions, and each state can be equal, and there won't be a problem with proportional, solve the problem. Well, no one's going to like this, right? So no one's going to go along with this. So states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North, South Carolina, and Georgia, they're all going to favor proportional representation, while New York, New Jersey, and Delaware are going to be on the side of the smaller states. Maryland and Connecticut are the swing votes here. Maryland is kind of split in between. But they're going to be sort of swing votes in this debate about representation. So keep this all in mind as we talk about these different proposals for a new government. And the first proposal we're going to look at is that from James Madison. James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution because he's the man who came to this committee prepared. Right? If you want to run a committee, if you want to join a committee and then have it reflect your values and your ideas, come prepared, right? So whenever they start the meeting and they're like, okay, so what are we doing? Who wants to start? Madison is the one that has just this voluminous understanding of constitutions. He had prepared himself in anticipation of the Annapolis Convention a year before. He had written notes to himself about different governments in antiquity. He had a plan called the Virginia Plan, which he is going to offer. Now, everyone knows James Madison is opposed to the existing government, and he's sort of an extremist in this case. So he wants his plan to be proposed by a moderate who won't be seen as biased and too big of a degree. So he gets his fellow delegate from Virginia, the governor, Edmund Randolph, to propose his Virginia plan. So let's take a look at what this Virginia plan is going to say. It is going to differ from the Articles of Confederation in that we have a bicameral legislature. Okay, we're going to have a bicameral legislature here, but pretty much everything's going to feed out of that legislature. The legislature is also proportionally based. Okay, so this is the large state plan. So let's take a look at a graphic here. I'm going to get out of the way so you can see it. Okay, so we have our 13 states at the bottom. So here's our 13 states. They are going to elect based on proportional representation and taxation. They're going to elect the first branch of this legislature. Okay, so the national legislature will be bicameral, elected by the states. Then the legislatures of those states will place nominees before this national legislature, and they will select the people to be in the upper chamber. All right, so we're seeing that the states do have some say in who's there, but it's based on proportion, right? So Virginia, Massachusetts, these larger states are going to have more representatives in this National Assembly, and they're going to be able to get what they want, as opposed to smaller states who they may nominate people to be in the upper house, but they're not going to have the popularity to get there. In addition, you're going to see that this legislature is going to elect a national executive, okay? So we almost have this executive committee that's going to be running the government. They're also going to establish the court system. All right, so Congress is going to establish courts, and so everything is coming out of the legislative branch. In many ways, this is not that different from. It's not that different than what we saw happening in England with Parliament. We have a king, right? We have a king, but Parliament has all the power. Parliament is passing the laws. Parliament is appointing the admiralty courts that are, operating because of the Revenue Acts. It's Parliament that's passing the taxes. It's Parliament that's telling, the king what's going on, and the king is enforcing it. So you still have the same overweighted influence of the legislature in this government, and that's gonna worry some people, as we'll find out. Now, the other proposal is from a man named William Paterson. William Paterson is going to offer an alternative on June 15th, 1787. This is called the Small State Plan, or the New Jersey Plan. I wanted to read to you a characterization of Paterson by a man who was in the convention, William Pierce from Georgia. He wrote, quote, "Mr. Paterson is one of those kind of men whose powers break in upon you and create wonder and astonishment. He is a man of great modesty, with looks that bespeak talents of no great extent. But he is a classic, a lawyer, and an orator, and a disposition so favorable to his advancement that everyone seemed ready to exalt him with their praises. He is very happy in the choice of time and manner of engaging in debate, and never speaks but when he understands his subject well. This gentleman is about 34 years of age and of low stature." So that kind of gives you a little sense of who Paterson is. He's a highly educated person. He comes from New Jersey, and he is going to offer a plan to counter Madison's plan. Now, the New Jersey plan is going to preserve the unicameral legislature that we see in the Confederation Congress. It's also going to preserve, and this was something that delegates from Delaware were adamant about, it's going to preserve the one state, one vote rule. There is no proportional representation here. Every state is equal. We all come together. We are not giving up our sovereignty. We come into this thing as equal partners, and you don't get extra votes just because you're bigger than I am. Right? So that's something that Delaware threatens to just walk out of the convention over. So that's something that we need to keep in mind as we discuss this. So let's take a look at his plan. So here we see, again, the 13 states. will select their state governments. These state governments will then create this legislature. This is a legislature. We have 2 to 7 representatives per state, and they will get an equal number of votes per state. This legislature will then create the executive, the judiciary, and the military. So all of this will come from a center unicameral body. This is not that different than the Confederation Congress, but it's, again, there's no separation of powers here. In either the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan, there's no separation of powers. There's not some, separate but equal judiciary branch. There's no separate but equal executive branch. That's not how this works. So this is going to be a sticking point for some people. Regardless, it doesn't appear as though we're going to find a solution to this. Neither side is willing to compromise on this, and so they're going to have to get together a separate committee. They get together a committee chaired by a man named Roger Sherman. And Roger Sherman is from Connecticut, which is why this new plan, this new proposal is called the Connecticut Plan. And Roger Sherman is going to be in charge of what the convention calls the Grand Committee. It includes delegates from all the different states, and their great compromise between the small state plan and the big state plan is to mix the two together into one. So we're going to have 2 legislative bodies, so why don't we base representation in the lower house, the lower body, on proportional representation. That way the bigger states will have an oversized vote, and that will seem more fair to them. But the other legislature, the Senate, let's make that more of an elite advisory role, and we'll allow it to represent the states. So each state will get 2 representatives, and the states come in as equals, regardless of their size. This seems to be a solution. Some of the bigger states are still not very sure about this. So Benjamin Franklin will borrow an earlier proposal that revenue bills originate in the House, controlled by proportional representation by the larger states. And that is going to be something that the larger states are like, okay, we'll be able to propose revenues. We'll be able to propose taxes, and the little states can't stop us, right? That's kind of what we'll sell this to them. All right, so that has to do with how we're balancing the representation question. Now, an aspect of representation that we will come back to is the issue of slavery, and that's going to be a huge issue. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about the other 2 branches of government. All right, so we're going to discuss the other 2 branches of government and how they were formed in this committee. And the presidency owes its existence more than any other person to a man named James Wilson. James Wilson, arguably the most educated delegate at the convention. He had 3 different degrees: a degree from the University of St. Andrews, University of Glasgow, and the University of Edinburgh. This man is very educated. He is one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence. He had served in the Continental Congress from Pennsylvania, and he is going to make some serious proposals into how the executive branch should look and how it should operate. If you'll notice, both the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, you had an executive that was chosen out of the legislature, right? And Wilson is worried about that. He's worried about a pay-to-play situation where, someone who wants to be president, who wants to wield this power, will simply bribe members of Congress to win this over and over and over. So he wants to make sure that the executive branch is separate and equal and beyond the corruption of a different branch of Congress. In order to accomplish this, he's going to suggest the Electoral College. And so Wilson is wanting the people to select their president. And so his suggestion was that each state should be divided into districts, and each district should select electors who meet and, quote, proceed to elect by ballot the President of the United States. So this is how the electoral system works. Each state is broken up into congressional districts. Dependent on how many representatives in Congress you have, you get that number of electors. So each state has a different electoral vote. you will cast your election on election day, not for president, but for a person who will go to Washington, who has the time and the money to travel all the way to Washington and cast a ballot for a person that they promise to vote for, right? So you don't have people voting specifically for, Washington, right, or Adams. You have someone in their district saying, vote for me. I will go to Washington and I will cast my vote for Washington, or I'll cast my vote for Adams. So that's how this works. And it's actually a pretty brilliant idea. It's a way to get people involved in the election of the president, and it makes it independent from the legislature branch, right? It makes it independent from the legislature. It really is quite a good idea. Some other ideas that Wilson will have for the executive is he wants it to be a unitary executive. He doesn't want a committee to run our government. He wants an individual, one person to run the government. So I'm going to quote for you his justification, his argument for the executive being unitary or singular. Quote, "Sir, we have a responsibility in the person of our president. He cannot act improperly and hide either his negligence or inattention. He cannot roll upon any other person the weight of his criminality, nor appointment can take place without his nomination, and he is responsible for every nomination he makes. We secure vigor. We well know what numerous executives are. We know there is neither vigor, decision, nor responsibility in them." And he goes on to say that they will be responsible to the people. They will be responsible to the people because they could be impeached and removed if they don't do a good job. So he's saying, look, if we get a committee and something bad happens, we don't know who to blame. But if we have a person on the top, one person who's responsible for all of these appointments, one person who has the weight of the executive and what it does on their shoulders, then we know who to blame. The next debate we want to take a look at is that of regarding the judiciary. The judiciary in Britain doesn't have an independence to it. It doesn't have that separate and equal branch of government. And this is something that the founders are definitely going to want to keep it in balance and to check the power of the people who appoint these judges. Madison, for example, he was very nervous about the British judiciary's reliance on the executive. So on the 13th, Madison and Randolph would propose a national judiciary whose, quote, "jurisdiction shall extend to cases which respect the collection of national revenue, impeachments, and questions which involve the national peace and harmony," unquote. Now, the purpose of having this national court was to give deference to a national government in terms of currency, taxes, and negotiating peace and things of that nature. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to concentrate some powers into this national government, and they're hoping that a judiciary, the court system, will be able to sort of lean in that direction and side with this national government in terms of revenue, taxation, impeachments of officials, and maintaining peace. Madison specifically objected to the idea that judges be appointed by the legislature. He feared that favoritism in the lower house would make these appointments sort of a pay-to-play situation, which is not that different than what Wilson was afraid of with the president. So the solution will be that the executive branch will appoint and the Senate will confirm. So it's sort of both branches, the legislative and executive, have to work together in order to create these judicial appointments. So that's sort of the compromise they have with that. So the next topic of debate that we need to discuss is the elephant in the room in the American founding, and that is the issue of slavery. Many of the founders were abhorred to slavery. They disliked slavery. Jefferson himself tried to put a phrase in the Declaration of Independence that would denounce King George for introducing slavery to the colonies. But slavery is going to be an institution that the southern states are dependent upon, especially after Bacon's Rebellion, as we've already discussed. So that's going to be an issue that can't be touched. It's like the third rail of politics. It's like the modern day abortion issue, or the modern day issue on the Second Amendment, right? It's something that you can't find a compromise, right? There's no way to get these various groups to agree on what should happen. It's just a very passionate issue at the time. But so that's what we're going to talk about. All right. So the issue here is the 3/5 compromise. Now, modern critics of our constitutional system will argue that the United States Constitution is founded in racism because it determined that a black person was only worth 3/5 of a white person. I think that this is a misreading of the history for a very clear reason. The clear reason is that the racists, the slave owners, wanted slaves to count as a full person. Slave owners wanted slaves to count as a full person for the purposes of representation because these slave states wanted to exploit their slave population to get more votes than they should have normally had in order to preserve slavery. Okay? So the 3/5 compromise, which was proposed by Wilson, the 3/5 compromise was designed to weaken the power of these slave states to some degree, right? Because they wanted 100% slaves to be counted for property and 100% slaves to be counted in their population, and the southern states would have a lot more representation than they should otherwise have. This is something that's going to make the northern states unhappy. Not that the northern states don't have slaves. They do. But they don't depend on it as much. It's not as big a part of their economy. And by the time we get to 1800, most of the northern states are going to outlaw the practice or phase it out by 1820, for example. So I want you to understand that the 3/5 compromise was introduced by Mr. Wilson, who was from Pennsylvania, not because he was racist against black people, but because he was trying to make it so that these southern racists could not have an oversized weight on the national government so that they could protect their interest in this abominable practice, right? So without the 3/5 compromise, it would be very difficult for Congress to pass any laws or do anything to challenge slavery. At least that was the contention if they set it up this way. And there's some truth to this because by 1860 there are 4 million. Unfortunately, there are 4 million slaves in the American South. If you were to add all of these people to the Congress, in terms of representation, that would give them a lot more votes in the House, which would make it difficult. But regardless, so let's look at the actual wording here. So Mr. Wilson is going to second a motion by Mr. Charles Pinckney where, and I'll read the quote, in order to add after the words, quote, equitable ratio of representation. So they're going to add after that the following words, quote, in proportion to the whole number of white and other free citizens and inhabitants of every age, sex, and condition, including those bound to servitude for a term of years, and 3/5 of all other persons not comprehended in the foregoing description, except Indians not paying taxes in each state. So here they're being very clear that if you have slaves, they will not be used to give the southern states an oversized weight in the national government. Now they're still going to get an oversized weight, and we'll see that, but it's not to the degree that it would be otherwise. This is going to raise alarm. I mean, a lot of delegates from other states are going to be upset about this. For example, a delegate from Massachusetts, Mr. Elbridge Gerry, he thought that property should not be the rule of representation. That your property isn't a question here. It should be about how many people are there, how many citizens are there. He asked the question, quote, why should the blacks who are property in the South be in the rule of representation more than the cattle and horses of the North? Basically, he's just forcing, what Gerry is trying to do, he's trying to force the South to admit that these people are in fact people, that slaves are human beings. They're not cattle, they're not horses, so we know that they're not. You're admitting that they're not. So why are we treating them as if they were, right? So he's really sort of pointing out the hypocrisy of these slaveholders in their attempt to try to defend this. Mr. Patterson of New Jersey would get up and he would question combining numbers and wealth. Okay, so he would question this, like, why are we looking at population and property and taxable property, like the wealth that you have? Why is that being used here? He saw that as being too vague, which is one reason why New Jersey would vote down or vote against the 3/5 compromise. He would regard African slaves in the South, quote, in no light but as property. They are no free agents, have no personal liberty, no faculty of acquiring property, but on the contrary are themselves property, and like other property entirely at the will of the master. Has a man of Virginia a number of votes in proportion to the number of his slaves? And if Negroes are not represented in the states to which they belong, why should they be represented in the general government? What is the true principle of representation? It is an expedient by which an assembly of certain individuals, chosen by the people, is substituted in place of the inconvenient meeting of the people themselves. In such a meeting of the people was actually to take place, would slaves vote? They would not. Why then should they be represented? He was also against the idea that we should have a slave trade. Okay, so this was another point of contention. Like, okay, so you're telling me that if you have slaves, you're going to get more votes in Congress. Okay, well then what's to stop you from going to Africa, kidnapping hundreds of people, bringing them back here against their will in order to pad the number of representatives you have in Congress? So the slave trade is going to be a serious problem. Like, you can't just import people against their will and then add on to the number of representatives you have in Congress. So this is a dramatic debate that's going on. Madison would stand up and he would admit that this was a fair argument. He would make a suggestion that the House of Representatives, which is proportional, be based on free citizens, and the upper body be proportional based upon guardianship of property, which would include slaves. Because what slaveholders are worried about is anti-slavery people regulating their institution. That's what they're worried about. They don't want their property to be taken from them with a vote, because, let's face it, they know that slavery is bad. They know it is. They're just trying to make themselves feel better, I suppose. They're economically too deep, and they feel like they can't get rid of this thing that they have to rely on so much for their wealth and for the wealth of their state. So they're making excuses for it, is the way I interpret it, but it'd be the way it is. So the 3/5 compromise would be approved as a way to limit the injustice of slavery and its ability to control the national government, but it's still going to it's still going to allow the southern states to dominate the government for a good 40 years and 30 years. Most of the presidents are going to be from Virginia. It's going to have an effect, but it helped to make the number of slaves that are exploited by these slaveholders. It made it lower, so that by 1820, the population in the North is going to overwhelm this 3/5 compromise. So this 3/5 compromise by 1820 is not going to give the southern states any additional weight in the national government, and that's going to be why you start hearing calls to regulate and change slavery starting in the 1820s, and the South is really going to dig in its heels and become more aggressive, and that's going to be, of course, leading up to the Civil War. I did want to read to you a speech by a man named Gouverneur Morris. He's a delegate from New York who rose to speak on the issue of slavery, and I found his speech to be rather interesting. Now, it's a rather long speech, but I feel like it's worth reading. So let me read that to you. So Mr. Morris rises to speak, and he says that slavery was a nefarious institution. It is a curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Compare the free regions of the Middle States, where a rich and noble cultivation marks the prosperity and happiness of the people, with the misery and poverty which overspread the barren wastes of Virginia, Maryland, and the other states having slaves. Travel though you whole continent, and you behold the prospect continually varying with the appearance and disappearance of slavery. The moment you leave the eastern states and enter New York, the effects of the institution become visible. Passing through the Jerseys and entering Pennsylvania, every criterion of superior improvement witnesses the change. Proceed south, and wildly in every step you take, though great region of slaves presents a desert increasing, an increasing proportion of these wretched beings. Upon what principle is it that the slave shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Then why is no other property included? The houses in the city of Philadelphia are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitants of Georgia and South Carolina, who go to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. So this is, to me, a perfect, just encompasses the whole argument. I searched through the debate when I read this, and I was looking for some defense. Like, how do these Southern slaveholders stand up and defend themselves against this claim, which is so perfectly articulated, that how in the world can you justify kidnapping and enslaving people in order to get an oversized voice in a government specifically designed to protect the rights of people? It is a great question, and I found no good reply. The only reply is that the Southern states will agree to outlaw the slave trade. Within 13 years, they would outlaw the slave trade. So that's the compromise here. Here it is, people. I mean, there's the dirty reality of it. Slavery is an abomination. It absolutely is. No one would argue that today. We've moved beyond this issue, thankfully. Slavery is an absolute abomination. I think everyone in that committee knew it. Everyone in the convention knew it was bad, knew it was a contradiction to the principles of our country. But they were so economically dependent on it, and they were politically dependent on it. There's no way a person from Virginia would stand up and say, yes, let's do away with slavery. They would lose their seat, and they would have no voice. So at least the people in the committee knew that slavery was bad, and reluctantly kind of tried to keep it going, knowing eventually, of course, that slavery would die off. And let's keep in mind, this is 1787. Slavery is not that big of a moneymaker at this time. Okay, slavery. Most people who look at slavery in the South are looking at the economic reality of it and saying, within 20 or 30 years, slavery is going to die out on its own. It's just going to peter out and whittle away because it doesn't make people a lot of money. Unfortunately, that is going to change with Eli Whitney in the 1790s, and that's a problem we're going to have to deal with. In order to illustrate for you the impact of this 3/5 compromise and how it altered how many representatives these states would get, I looked at the census in 1790. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you see this. So this is the U.S. Census in 1790. It gives you an idea of how many total people there are, how many freed people, how many slave people. You can see the distribution of that. And based upon these numbers, I tried to figure out how many additional representatives each of these states would get. It's basically one representative for every 30,000 souls in the state. So because of this rule, Maryland would get an additional 2 representatives. Virginia would get an additional 6 for a total of 10 representatives. North Carolina and South Carolina would each get 2, and Georgia would get 0.6, basically 1 additional representative. So we're talking 2, 4, 6, 7, 12, right? 12 or 13 additional members of Congress that come from the 3/5 compromise. that's only 3/5. Imagine if we didn't have a 3/5 compromise. Imagine if they didn't make this arrangement. Then you take that entire slave population, that's almost 700,000 people, and you divide that by 30,000. That's how many additional representatives that you're looking at. I mean, approximately. I mean, I'm doing this, as an estimate. So let's see, 694,000 divided by 30,000. That's an extra 23 representatives for the South. That's a lot. And keep in mind that every member of Congress and every senator, that's an electoral vote as well. So the South is getting about 12 additional votes for president because of the 3/5 compromise. But without that compromise, they have an additional 23 or 24 votes. So this 3/5 compromise is going to it's going to give the South an advantage. But in exchange for that, they're going to outlaw the slave trade, right? Which is going to be a great thing. The United States will work with Great Britain to shut down the slave trade across the Atlantic. Now, I also want to note that New York received one additional representative as well for their slave population, approximately. But 5 states are going to have 38% of all the seats here, and 45% of those are going to be a result of the 3/5 compromise. So you're looking at a compromise that is going to greatly impact U.S. government. It's going to greatly impact the number of representatives that the South will have. All right, so we've got this Constitution written. We've had our compromises. We've had our debates. We've had our arguments. We've ironed out a Constitution with 3 separate and equal branches of government, with most of the power being given to the people through the legislative branch, but with a unitary executive with the power to veto, with a judicial Supreme Court that would oversee national issues, but a limited government, right? A legislature that had enumerated powers, right? The Constitution tells Congress what it may do, which means it doesn't have to list all the things it can't do. You just assume if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it, right? That's the assumption. But this Constitution is without a doubt far more powerful in terms of its centralizing influence. And a lot of these small state people who refuse to even go to the convention are going to be opposed to this. So this new Constitution was presented to the Confederation Congress with some trepidation, right? I mean, so this convention was designed to alter the Confederation Congress, not completely replace it. So they're kind of nervous about what this Confederation Congress is going to do when they present this new Constitution for ratification. To their great joy, the Confederation Congress would approve it and present it to the states. And so immediately you end up with 2 camps, those that like it and those who don't like it. And these camps are called Federalist and Anti-Federalist. So the fight to ratify the Constitution, that's what we're going to take a look at now. And let's take a look at the people who aren't so happy about it. So the people who are most disturbed with this new Constitution are heroes of the American Revolution, right? These are heroes. Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Clinton. They're not just Southerners. They're not just Northerners. There's a mixture of people. George Clinton is from New York, and Adams is from Massachusetts. Jefferson and Henry are from Virginia. They're going to have problems with this document, and almost immediately they're going to begin writing letters to the editor under pseudonyms like Cato, right, as a Roman senator, right, as a sentinel, federal farmer, and Brutus. So these pen names are references to Roman republicanism, right? Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, both had problems with the first 3 words of the document: "We the people." This seemed to challenge the existence of states altogether. It looked like they were trying to dissolve the states with this phrase, and that made people very nervous. Jefferson feared a national government that might challenge state authority as well. Governor of New York, George Clinton, likewise feared the size of this government. So several other founding fathers are going to present a counter case. These anti-federalists are going to have basically 7 problems with the U.S. Constitution that they're going to present. The first of these is that this Constitution needs a Bill of Rights. What they see is this very powerful executive branch, this influential legislative branch. They see a very powerful government here, and they're worried that they'll be able to pass laws on whatever they want. So we need to be able to protect certain basic rights. And their argument is we're not going to ratify this thing. We don't think it should be ratified unless it is amended to include a Bill of Rights to protect the rights of the people. Number two, this Constitution creates a presidency with so much power it has the potential to become a monarch. This is a president that has an army. It has the control to veto. It has it can administer the state in any way that it sees fit. So it's a very powerful, singular, unitary executive that makes people nervous. They're worried that the president could become some strong man. Number three, many feared the judiciary would go out of control. They were worried that this judiciary would be so beholden to the government itself, to the legislative branch and to the executive, that it would give preferences to the government as opposed to giving equal preferences to the states or to the people. And so they were worried that the courts would become some type of super legislature that would pass laws that to benefit, or pass rulings that would benefit the government, the federal government, against the state government. And that's actually going to be very true. That's absolutely going to happen. Number four, the fourth thing they're worried about, Constitution challenges state power. So they're worried that states' rights will be violated because this federal government has the power to pass laws that can interfere with local ordinances. Number five, they were fearful of the creation of a standing army. The president would be in charge of an army. This is something that could be used to bring about tyranny, and they were very uncomfortable with that. Number six, many of these critics feared the rise of an aristocracy that would repress the common man. So you're going to have this sort of elite group of people, right? These elite senators who represent their state legislatures. You're going to have these sort of elite men, in the House, and there's too much separation between these politicians and the people, and so you'll end up with sort of like a special class of people who are beyond the law. That was a fear, which of course 200 years later we can look at that and say, yeah, it's valid. Number seven, they feared a scheme of representation in this national government. So they just didn't like the idea that that these representatives would be working in the name of these other people. And so these seven complaints, harken back directly to the causes of the revolution. We don't like arbitrary power. We want the people to have more of a voice. We're worried about these judges and who they're going to be loyal to. We're concerned about this executive branch. So all these problems are hearkening back to the revolution that they just fought. Patrick Henry would compare the tyranny of Philadelphia may be like the tyranny of George III. So in other words, you're sending all this power to Philadelphia and trusting that they're not going to abuse it. And he's like, they're going to abuse it. The problem with these arguments, these anti-federalists, is that they failed to present a valid alternative government. All right, so it's one thing to stand up and say, well, this government you're offering, it's not any good. It has all these problems with it, but not offering a solution of your own. So these men were kind of arguing for the status quo, and they didn't offer any viable solution to the problems that were facing the Confederation, and so they're not going to get as much traction. Another problem that these men face is that they're not nationalist. They are loyal to their state. So, for example, Samuel Adams, he's not going to campaign in New York. He's not going to campaign in Connecticut. He's going to campaign in Massachusetts. Jefferson and Henry, they'll campaign in Virginia. So because these people are so devoted to their localities, they're not going to organize a nationwide campaign to fight this Constitution. And the Federalists, the people who are in support of our Constitution, are nationalist. They do support the idea of a national government, and they do and will campaign across state lines in order to convince people that this new Constitution should be ratified. So let's take a look at these Federalists, shall we? The Federalists are the people who are supporting the passage and the ratification of this new Constitution. So they're very careful to avoid the evil term nationalist, right? We're not nationalist. So they coined a new phrase called Federalist, basically the idea that we have a federal system. You have independent states on the bottom, and then you have a federal government which will sort of mitigate whatever problems may arise between these different states. If the states have a problem that they want to solve, it's the federal government that will make that solution. But the federal government, in their minds at this time, would not be used to cram down any particular preference on the various states. But regardless, this national mindset will help them think outside of their state, which I just explained will be one of the reasons why they're successful. Now, the three men responsible for writing a collection of essays to defend the Constitution are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. They're the principal authors of it. John Jay jumped in, I think, for one little essay, and then he's sort of lumped in with the rest of these men, but he really is sort of a minor character here. But the Federalist Papers is what they're called. There are a total of 85 different articles, of which Alexander Hamilton wrote the vast majority of them. Okay, he's a prolific writer. He was writing tons and tons and tons of articles trying to offer a concise defense for this new government and why it's preferred. So in Federalist Number 1, Alexander Hamilton outlined the topics for these essays. So he basically says we're going to have a series of essays, and we're going to cover the utility of union and prosperity in Federalist 2 through 14. It's important that we as a country stay together, and this will lead to our future prosperity. Then they will outline the insufficiencies of the current government. So between Federalist 15 and Federalist 22, Madison and Hamilton will outline the problems with the existing government, right? So this is what we need to stay together. That's the first 14 Federalist Papers. We need to understand that our current government is a failure. It's not doing its job. And then Federalist 23 to 36 is about the necessity of having an energetic government. We need a government that has some power, that has the ability to defend itself from rebellion, that has the power to collect taxes, and is energetic in its ability to maintain order. Federalists 37 through 84 have to do with conformity of the Constitution to the true principles of Republican government, saying that this system of government is more rational, it's more enlightened, and it's more in tune with the tradition of Republican forms of government, where we're going to have these separate branches. There's going to be checks and balances within the system, and it's going to allow states to maintain their rights. The final part, the 85th paper written by Hamilton, basically compares the various state constitutions to this Constitution, to this proposed Constitution, saying that they're very similar. Like you're all against this new Constitution we wrote, but it's very similar to what you did in your state. So it's actually not that crazy. It's not some dramatic and dangerous thing. There are several key Federalist Papers that I could point you toward, and so one of my favorite is actually Federalist Number 10, where James Madison tries to explain why a Republican form of government is preferred to, say, a democracy or some other form of government. And he tries to explain why our Constitution will try to solve an age-old problem. And that problem, of course, is faction or political parties. Political parties are seen as a great evil of the ancient world. They've been the destruction of previous free governments, and there was nervousness that political faction and parties would lead to the destruction of our government as well. And this new Constitution, Madison proposed, would prevent the abuses of these factions. So I wanted to read to you parts of Federalist Number 10 to try to help you understand why and how he thinks this Constitution will stop political faction. So, quote, Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregated interest of the community. So in other words, a political party. I'll continue. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it is worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be wise to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. This is a brilliant little argument. He basically says, okay, well, we got two things we can do here. We can take away people's different opinions, and we can take away their freedom altogether. So if we're trying to solve the problem of faction, problems that caused by political disagreement, then just end all political disagreement. Countries do this. North Korea does this. Venezuela does this. Cuba does this. If you look back to the ancient constitutions, you can look at ancient Sparta. They did this as well. They did away with individual liberty and freedom and made everyone have the same opinions, or they suppressed you to the point where you were afraid to express your opinions, like in the Soviet Union. So this is one of the two things we can do to control faction. And he says, well, this is insane. This is worse than the disease, right? We'd rather have factions and liberty than no liberty and no factions, right? So you're just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'll continue quoting. The second expedient is as impractical as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. So, in other words, you are going to begin defining yourself based on your values. Your values and your opinions become your definition. And so to change your opinion on something is literally to change your identity, to change your definition for yourself. And so people tend to dig in and resist these changes. And so you can't make everyone agree, is what he's saying. And so the solution of our Constitution was that it was going to be a republic. And the idea behind a republic is that you would have so many different political parties spread over so far and wide an area that no two of them would be able to get enough power to wield nationally, right? So like the assumption is that, look at these various states. They barely work together as it is. Why would someone from Massachusetts and someone from South Carolina have anything in common? They're completely different cultures, completely different ways of living, completely different economies. They have nothing in common. So we're not just going to have two political parties. We're going to have multiple parties in each state. That's the assumption. Like a republic would allow a multiplicity of parties, and that overabundance of political parties would prevent any one group from gaining too much power. This little theory is going to be interesting, but it's immediately going to be proven untrue, even if you look at the current debate going right now with the ratification of this Constitution. You've got immediately people who are for the Constitution, Federalist, and the people who are against the Constitution, the Anti-Federalist. There's not some plethora of different political opinion, because essentially there are two answers to every political question, yes or no. And so everyone's going to be boxed into basically two political parties, and that's going to be the truth for much of our history. We're going to have two political parties. So Madison's idea, while well-spoken and eloquent, is not going to be proven to be true or based in fact, but it is one of the efforts of the Constitution. Another interesting quote from the Federalist Papers, Federalist Number 51, Madison is trying to explain how the separate branches will preserve freedom and prevent the government from establishing a tyranny. And this is an interesting thing. So I'm going to quote Federalist 51. He says, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men, over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." So this is the genius of our Constitution. The assumption is that if you're in the House of Representatives, your power rests in that the House become more powerful. If you're in the Senate, your power rests in that the Senate become more powerful. If you're the president, you want the executive branch to be more powerful. So all of these people who are going to obtain positions of power, they're ambitious people, otherwise they wouldn't be in that position. So we're going to set their ambition to counteract the ambition of other people. So because if the president gets more powerful, the legislature has to lose power, right? If the judiciary were to gain power, the executive would have to lose power. And so because there's so much jockeying back and forth for them to gain power, this basically is the hope, is that these various branches of government will battle one another to the point where no one group will be able to really establish a tyranny. What we've found over the last several hundred years, however, is that this also is proven not to be the case. Currently, Congress is more interested in giving away its power in order to preserve, short-term money or position in Congress. So it's become a little bit of a different situation, but that was the idea behind our Constitution. All right, so these are the arguments both for and against it. So let's take a look at the actual ratification of the document. Only 9 states were required for ratification of this document, according to the Constitution as it was written. That's very different than what the article said. The article said only changes could occur if it was unanimous, right? So Rhode Island, they're going to hold out. They're like, nope, we're with the articles the whole way. We're not doing this. But the rest of the states agreed to it, and the Confederation Congress even agreed to it. So during this ratification debate, Anti-Federalists, they're fearing the central government would eventually abuse its power. And they want a Bill of Rights. Now, Hamilton will write in Federalist Number 84 that this would not be necessary. Because, quote, he says, "I go further and affirm that bills of rights in the sense and to the extent in which they are contended for are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted." All right, so he's saying that, Congress shall pass no law respecting free speech. Well, Hamilton's looking at the Constitution going, where in the Constitution does it say Congress can do anything about free speech? Nowhere. So Congress can't do it. So by you saying Congress can't mess with free speech, that means, well, Congress can do more things than are in the Constitution, right? So his argument is that a Bill of Rights is unnecessary because the Constitution is very strict about what can and cannot be done. We're going to find that this is almost immediately tested in the 1790s, where you're going to end up with 2 different interpretations of the Constitution, one strict and one more loose and fluid. And so we're going to find that Hamilton is not even going to agree with himself within a matter of years. But despite Hamilton's reassurances, many states only would agree to ratify this new government if it was amended with a Bill of Rights. For example, the Massachusetts Convention was highly contested. The memory of Shays' Rebellion was hanging over the proceedings, and they were kind of nervous about this. Some of the delegates feared open rebellion if a stronger government were not established. Others, mostly poor farmers, were sympathetic to Shays. Like, what are you talking about? I mean, we fought a war to be free, and we're afraid this government would allow these lawyers and these learned men, these money people, to gloss over, quote, I'll quote a Massachusetts delegate named Amos Singletary. He said that he was afraid that, quote, lawyers, men of learning, and moneyed men that talk so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly to make us poor little people swallow down the pill, unquote. He's like, we don't trust you. You elites, you people that are too smart for your own good, you're going to give yourself all this power and then we're going to be stuck following whatever you want. No, we want a Bill of Rights. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth here. Eventually they're going to go to John Hancock and Samuel Adams and these leaders of Massachusetts, and they're going to say, what say you, right? You're a very popular governor, John Hancock. Samuel Adams was a popular revolutionary. They agreed to support this new Constitution with the caveat that it has a Bill of Rights. And this is going to create what's called the Massachusetts Compromise, this sort of formalized idea that, okay, so we are going to make it easier for states to pass this. We're going to put together a state convention. We're immediately going to modify this Constitution with a series of amendments to protect rights, and then it'll take effect. So that's going to win a lot of votes. Once Massachusetts does this compromise, a lot of states are going to jump in. New York and Virginia were battling back and forth also, trying to see who was going to ratify this, and it became a moot point when New Hampshire ratified it. So at that point, once 9 states ratified it, the other states then had to say, okay, well, are we going to have a voice in these Bill of Rights? Are we going to have a voice in this government? Or are we just going to be dragged along reluctantly? And so then other states started to ratify very quickly. The only holdout, as I mentioned, was Rhode Island. They're going to hold out all the way until 1790 when the Constitution's already put in place. Now, New York would be influenced in some degree by John Jay, who wrote the New York Circular Letter, which also suggested basically arguing for the ratification of the Constitution. So we'll see that, by 1788, this new Constitution is ratified, and the United States looks like this. This is what we're looking like now. We're a series of states along the coast. We have this territory that's still unorganized, and now we have a brand new Constitution, and we're going to have to elect a president and a new Congress and amend our Constitution and figure out how to establish a singular government. So when we come back in our next lecture, we'll be talking about this very first administration, right? The administration of George Washington, and the difficulties and the way in which this man is going to provide an example of how to behave for future presidents. Right? See you then.